Michela, it's my pleasure to join you today in the framework of this very interesting seminar. And I will, as Michela told you, I will present the main results of this research project at Bieta Giyorgis, a research project which was taking place in an area which is very close to Aksum, as you will see. I hope you can see my presentation now. So I think we can start. Good. So just to remind you where we are, which is the area we will speak about today. So we are speaking about a region of the northern Ethiopian and Eritrean islands. More specifically, we will focus in the Aksum region, which is called the central zone in terms of administrative division of Tigray today. And you can see we are approaching the area we will deal with. On the right side, you have a Landsat image. And this is practically the area of Aksum and surroundings. As you will see later on, the town of Aksum is becoming a city, actually is expanding a lot in the last years, at least before the civil war started last November. Anyway, is more or less here where I'm showing you with the pointer. And as you can see, the area, which is practically overlapping the ancient city of Aksum, the capital city of the Aksumite kingdom, is surrounded by these hills. Bieta Giyorgis, the area which was studied by the Italian American expedition, is this one. So it's right north of Aksum. Here you can see on the left side of the slide the dam, and you see the town of Aksum here. This is the hill of Maiko, and this is Bieta Giyorgis. And you can see Bieta Giyorgis also in the picture on the right is the hill behind the famous Aksumite stele of the Mayeja Stele Park. So it's very close to Aksum, as you can understand. Investigations by my university in that area started in 1974, and at the time, in 1973 and 74, at the time, the investigations were directed by Professor Lanfranco Ricci. You can see a picture of Professor Ricci after his retirement on the left side of the slide, and was taking part to these investigations, to this fieldwork, also Professor Fattovich, who was starting in 1974 teaching Ethiopian archaeology at l'Orientale, at the time Istituto Universitario Orientale. And you can see a picture of Professor Fattovich on the right. This was taken inside one of the tombs we were excavating on Bieta Giyorgis. So, as I think Luisa told you last time, at the very beginning, they were focusing on the site of Seglamien, which is southwest of Aksum, as you can see also on the map. It is marked on the map and showing you with the pointer. It is here. This is Aksum, and Bieta Giyorgis is here. In 74, they decided to move from Seglamien to Bieta Giyorgis, and they decided to focus on two structures. On the southwestern side, on the southwestern edge of Bieta Giyorgis. Bieta Giyorgis, as I show you, is a practically flat hill. This kind of hill is very typical of the northern Ethiopian and Eritrean highlands. It is locally called Amba. So on top of this flat hill, there are, as you will see, many archaeological sites. Two of them were already recorded in 1906 by the German expedition, the Deutsche Aksum Expedition, when they were conducting the first scientific archaeological fieldwork in Aksum. And Ricci and Fattovich in 1974 decided to explore these two structures which were recorded by the German archaeologists at the beginning of the 20th century. They were here, as you can see. So you have Aksum downtown in the map, dressed by von Lübke, who was the architect of the German expedition, and they are marked by the number 3 here in the aerial photo on the right. So you see Aksum here, the town, the Mayeja stele field, we were looking at it in the picture before, is marked by number 15, and behind the stele field you have the Bieta Giyorgis. The sites which were excavated in 1974 by Ricci and Fattovich are the ones marked by number 3. And these were labeled by the Germans as ruin F, upslope, and ruin E, downslope, as you can see nearby this river, which is a kind of seasonal river, which is called Mai Lakla, draining from the top of Bieta Giyorgis to the area of Dongur in Aksum. Here on the right side of the slide, you can see the map of ruin E, that is the ruin downslope, dressed by von Lübke. This structure was investigated at the very end of the 74 field season, but nevertheless, Ricci and Fattovich, they were able to collect some data suggesting that it was a church. Here you can see some of the pictures which were taken during the field season, and you have some elements on one side showing you that, of course, we are dealing with an Aksumite building, because it is a monumental Aksumite building, moreover, because it is characterized by this kind of stepped podium, which is very typical of the Aksumite monumental buildings. Moreover, you can see also that there are kind of niches, that is, the walls are somehow recessed. And this is also a further typical element of the Aksumite architecture. And but of course, as I told you, this structure was which was labeled by the Italian expedition as Bieta Giyorgis inferiore. Inferiore means downslope, and was identified with the church. Why? Because, of course, on the surface, they were collecting this kind of capital, and of course, you see is characterized by a vegetal pattern, but of course you have the cross here on the top emerging from the vegetation, and which is very typical, moreover, still now of the Ethiopian culture. You have this very close relation between the cross and the vegetation. You have crosses which are characterized by all this decoration, very complex patterns, so on. And so this was suggesting that it was a church. And moreover, they found this basin, which is a baptistry. So, of course, this is the confirmation, I will say the final confirmation that this was a church. But unfortunately, they were not able to finish the investigation of this structure because the rainy season was starting. As you know, the Ethiopian and Eritrean islands are characterized by very heavy rains starting more or less from mid-June and up to the end of September. And so they have to stop, to interrupt the investigation, and they were planning to go back to finish the investigation of this structure in 1975. They were never able to do this because in 1974 there was the revolution in Ethiopia. So the Emperor Haile Selassie, the reign of Emperor Haile Selassie was ended by a military uprising, and a military junta, the so-called Derg, formed, and in the meantime also a civil war between the central state, which was becoming a Marxist Leninist state, and some peripheral regions started. Tigray, that is the region where Aksum is located, was one of these regions, and so they were fighting against the central government, and at that point it was impossible to continue the archaeological investigation in the region. So they were never able to go back to finish the investigation of this ruin, but we can be sure that it was a church. Before this, they were investigating another, sorry, I'm trying to, another structure, which is upslope. Bieta Giyorgis superiore means Bieta Giyorgis upslope. And in this case, of course, they were investigating the structure before starting Bieta Giyorgis inferiore, and they had at least several weeks of work here. And in this case, they were able to understand that it was a structure, also in this case, most likely it was a church, characterized by two main phases. And so you can see in the the later phase, you have this rectangular structure with pillars inside, most likely dividing the inner space into three naves. And you have also this wall. They were able to bring to light just a part of it, this rounded wall around this square structure. But this church was built on top of an earlier church. So most likely this is a late Aksumite or early medieval church. This can be stated on the basis of the associated materials. But the earliest church, and this is built on top of it, it is a typical Aksumite church. And you can see again also in the section here, the stepped walls. You see the walls with these setback parts forming the typical Aksumite pattern. So a typical Aksumite monumental structure, we can say. And associated most likely with the later church, there are also several tombs. Some of them may be, from the stratigraphic point of view, in the between the two architectural phases actually. Anyway, here you have some pictures, some showing you some of the details of the excavation. Here you can see very well the later church built on top of the earlier Aksumite church. Here you can see the curve apse of the Aksumite church, and this is one of the tombs. As you can see, some of them, they were carefully prepared and covered by stone slabs, and also architectural decoration suggesting, confirming, I will say, that this was a church, like these stone slabs characterized again by the cross pattern, and also this very nicely made capital. But what is interesting is that inside this structure, they were also finding, mainly related to the second architectural phase, that is the later late Aksumite or early medieval church, some reuse elements. That is, elements, architectural elements, which were brought here from other areas and were reused in building the small rectangular church. Here you can see one of these elements, and you see a second one also here. As you can see, these are regular slabs with the rounded top. There is a rounded side, and most likely these were stele, Aksumite stele, which were reused in building the church, dating to the late Aksumite early medieval phase. So for this reason, Ricci and Fattovich started exploring also the rest of the hill, the northern, the central and the northern part of the Bieta Giyorgis hill. They wanted to understand, to identify the site from where these Aksumite stele were taken to be re-employed in the building of the church. And in this way, also asking their workers, they were able to discover and to record two huge sites, a very large settlement area, which is named Nagast. I'm showing you the settlement area here with a pointer, as you can see, is in the southwestern part of the Bieta Giyorgis hill, and it is standing up to the area of the two churches, which are more or less here. And this was named by at the time when Ricci was asking about the traditional name of this site. His workers, who were mainly people from the top of the hill, where some villages are agricultural villages are located. Well, the workers, they were calling this area Ela Nagast. Ela means well of the king. And actually there is a kind of basin for collecting water, as I will show you later on, and it's also very visible in the map here. I'm showing it with the pointer. And but the stele were not arriving from this huge settlement area, but from the northern side, which is a cemetery. Is located more or less in the middle of the flat hill, and it is called Ona and Aboi. I would like to stress that both the names are very intriguing, because Ona Nagast means the ruin of the kings. Ela Nagast means the well of the kings, as I told you. Ona Enda Zewge, it means the ruin of the Zewge. I don't know if you are aware about the fact that the Zewge is the name of an Ethiopian dynasty who was ruling the country from the 12th to the 13th century AD, so in medieval times. One of them, Lalibela, is the builder of the very famous site of Lalibela. Roha also named after him, Lalibela. So both the names of the two sites, the traditional names, are somehow relating these two sites to the Ethiopian Aksumite and also post-Aksumite kings. And also the Liber Aksume is mentioning the fact that before establishing Aksum, the kings, they were living nearby, perhaps on top of Bieta Giyorgis. So for this reason, Ricci and Fattovich, they were also planning to go back to investigate these sites in the mid-70s, but it was impossible to do this because, as I told you, it was no more possible to continue archaeological investigation in northern Ethiopia at the time. The Ethiopian Civil War ended in 1991, and at that time, it was possible to resume investigation. In 1992, we went there with Rodolfo Fattovich. At the time, Rodolfo was teaching as a visiting professor of archaeology in Addis Ababa University, and me and my colleague Cinzia Perligeli, at the time we were both PhD students, we were going there to join him to study museum collection, and we had the chance to go with him for the first time after a gap of 20 years to visit Aksum, to visit also this site. And in the same period, also a couple of American archaeologists from Boston University, Catherine Bard and Mike Di Blasi, were visiting Ethiopia because they wanted to start a research project in Ethiopia. Catherine Bard was at the time professor of Egyptian archaeology and and Mike Di Blasi was a specialist of African archaeologists, and he was already involved in field work in this area, because when he was a student in the early 70s, he was taking part in the survey, in the general survey of the very large area between Eritrea and Tigray, conducted by the University of Pennsylvania and under the direction of Joseph Michaels. So also Michaels was visiting the top of Bieta Giyorgis, and they were recording these two sites. So at that point, as these two sites were interesting for both sides, the Oriental Institute in Naples and Boston University, we decided to organize a joint expedition. And it was a very fruitful experience. We were working there up to 2002 as a joint expedition, and we were excavating both in the cemetery on Enda and the settlement area on Nagast. Here in the map on the right side of the slide, you can see the areas, which are the squares, green and blue squares, which were investigated from 1993, when the first fieldwork took place, up to 2002. Well, in 1993, we were starting from the cemetery, from Ona Enda Aboi Zewge. And it was a very promising beginning, because there we were able to identify a previously unnoticed phase of the Aksumite culture, the so-called Proto-Aksumite culture. We were working, as you can see, in a cemetery characterized by this irregular stele. Actually, the very regular ones, which were re-employed in the church I showed you before, were taken from a different spot, from a different part of this cemetery. But in 1983, we were mainly focusing on this excavation unit and Aboi Zewge first, where we were bringing to the light this rubble platform. It was kind of a platform made of rubble. On top of it, the stele were erected, and on top of it, sometimes also in other parts of the cemetery, we were able also to identify some concentration of pottery, but also animal bones. Most likely these were offering places on top of the funerary platform, and of course they are very disturbed, as you can see, mainly because this is a cultivated area. I told you that the top of Bieta Giyorgis is characterized still today by villages of farmers, so they are cultivating in this area, which are corresponding to the archaeological sites. So for this reason, with the plow, they were disturbing the top of the platform and also the offering places which were on top of it. And we were able also to identify in the platform, but excavated also in the bedrock, which was covered by these rubble platforms. We were able to excavate quite a number of tombs going back to this phase, and we were also able to collect dating evidence suggesting that this previously unknown phase of the Aksumite culture was dating back between the late 4th century before Christ and the mid-1st century before Christ. Here you have some pictures showing you, of course, the pits on top of the platforms, characterized by this square or rounded shape. And after that, if you go down, you move the rubble from inside, you reach the part of the pit which is excavated inside the bedrock. And inside the bedrock, you have usually a square or rounded funerary chamber covered by stone slabs, as you can see here on the left. And of course, the skeletons, very badly preserved, but anyway, they were in tight, contracted position, also because at the bottom of these pits, there was a very, very small space. You see also the reconstruction of a couple of these Proto-Aksumite pit graves on the right side of the slide. And we were collecting these Proto-Aksumite materials both inside the graves as grave goods and also on top of the platforms. They were using, as I told you, many ceramics for these funerary ceremonies, most likely kind of funerary meals they were organizing on top of the platforms. And you see also the typical shapes of these vessels with this ring base, these handles, very, very typical handles, and also on the opposite side, these horizontal grips. These are already, or the globular shape with the cylindrical neck of the flasks and bottles, and these are already the typical shapes which are surviving, continuing also in the later phases of the Aksumite culture. That's why we were calling it Proto-Aksumite, representing the earliest phase of the Aksumite culture. Of course, you have also ceremonial vessels like this basin with this animal figurine in the middle, and also this ledge of a very large hemispherical basin with this snake. You see, that is the snake which is modeled on top of it, and this is a fragmentary flask. Inside the tombs, we were also finding metal objects like weapons. Here you have a arrowhead, but also model weapons like this very small model of an axe. Both of them are bronze, and you have personal ornaments like these bronze bracelets, seals. Very interesting. This is a seal, and of course, the fact that you have very rich graves, the fact that you have seals is suggesting that already at the time, at the very beginning of the Aksumite culture, already most likely in the 3rd century before Christ, there is a complex society and hierarchical society in this area. So this is the beginning, we can say, of this development leading most likely from the social point of view to the formation of the Aksumite kingdom. Most likely we are dealing here with the origins of the Aksumite complex society, which later on became a true kingdom and one of the most powerful states in the late Roman and late antique phases. And you have also some imported materials. As you can see here on the top left of the slide, you have these mosaic glass beads. These were made most likely in late Ptolemaic Egypt. And so you start having, since the very beginning, traces of the involvement of the Aksum region also in this long distance networks of interaction, which is very, very interesting. But we were also moving to the Nagast site, to the settlement area, and there you see this is right in the middle of a village, so it was impossible to conduct a very extensive excavation, but we were able to identify and to excavate a part of a large building. And you see here the map with this very long rectangular rooms. Most likely these were kind of storerooms in the basement of the building. And so this was, it was also apparently very symmetrical. So it was most likely a monumental building. We can say this because of the symmetry, because of the fact that you have a stepped walls, so you have something, as I already told you, is typical of the Aksumite architecture, already evident in this building, going back to the Proto-Aksumite phase. And you have also the indented walls. You see, you have this part of the walls which are set back, which is a very typical pattern, as I told you, commenting also about the churches of the Aksumite architecture. So already in this monumental Proto-Aksumite building, we don't know if it was a palace, a temple, we have no idea, but nevertheless, it was a monumental building. You have the typical features of the Aksumite architecture already evident, as it is for the funerary rituals, because already you have the stele, you have grave goods which are somehow related to the later Aksumite artifacts. So we were filling a gap, because before the excavations on the top of Bieta Giyorgis, on Nagast, on Enda, Aboi, Zewge, well, the phase between the end of the, let's say, pre-Aksumite or Ethiopian, we can discuss a lot about the terminology for this phase, actually. And I think you will speak about this also with Iris Gerlach next time. Anyway, we can have a debate if Michela wants to organize it. Anyway, let's say after the end of the pre-Aksumite, in this specific part of the Ethiopian islands, there was practically a gap up to the 1st century AD, when we have the first evidence of the Aksumite culture. And now we were filling precisely that gap in the second half of the first millennium BC. And it was also interesting to remark that we were adding elements to the reconstruction, for example, of the history of the Aksumite funerary tradition, because in the mid-70s, early 80s, after the end of the fieldwork, because of the civil war in northern Ethiopia, Rodolfo Fattovich was starting investigation in the Eritrean Sudanese lowlands, and there he was bringing to light cemeteries going back to the third and the second millennium before Christ, precisely characterized by stele. And Rodolfo published a couple of articles in an Ethiopian Archaeology du Nil Moyen, suggesting the fact that these proto-historic third or second millennium before Christ funerary stele may have been the ancestors of the big, huge Aksumite funerary stele. And now, with excavations in Bieta Giyorgis, we were adding a step on this path, an intermediate step between the protohistoric stele from the Eritrean Sudanese lowlands and the Aksumite stele dating to the second half of the first millennium before Christ. More recently, the investigations at Seglamien, I'm sure that Luis already told you about this, added a further step, dating to the first half of the first millennium before Christ. So we were not only filling this gap, characterizing the second half of the first millennium before Christ, before the investigations at Nagast and Enda, but we were also contributing to the reconstruction of a model about the origins of some funerary habits characterizing the Aksumite culture. The same can be said also about the monumental building. Because, as I told you, the Nagast monumental building is already showing some features of the Aksumite architecture in the first millennium AD. And you have a very good example here on the right side of the slide. This is the reconstruction of the Taka Mariam Palace, which was elaborated by the German archaeologists on the basis of their investigations in Aksum downtown at the very beginning of the 20th century. Now we know that actually, like in the case of the stele, Nagast in this case, Bieta Giyorgis in general, is in just a step on this path, because we know that a similar buildings, they were already occurring in pre-Aksumite times, that is in the first half of the first millennium before Christ. And here on the left side of the slide, you have the reconstruction of the palace of Grat Bal Gebri in Yeha, which was investigated by Francis Sanfray and more recently by the German expedition. I'm sure that Iris next time will tell you a lot about this very impressive building, which is very interesting because you can already see the stepped walls and also the recessed walls and the use of wood in the architectural structure of the building, embedded in the stone walls and so on, which are all elements continuing passing through the Nagast evidence up to Aksumite times. So we were tracing back, thanks to the investigation of Bieta Giyorgis, several elements typical of the Aksumite cultural tradition. Moreover, we were showing that there was a very strong continuity between, let's say, the pre-Aksumite on one side, dating to the first half of the first millennium before Christ, and the Aksumite dating to the first millennium AD. Up to this investigation, before the investigation of Bieta Giyorgis, on the contrary, if you read, for example, the handbook, Les Anciens Ethiopiens, published by Francis Sanfray, the father of Ethiopian archaeology in 1981, is, of course, explaining more or less the situation between the pre-Aksumite and the Aksumite, calling this phase as the intermediate period, a very obscure phase, very centuries of darkness, we can say, because at the time there were very few archaeological elements to tell more. But anyway, he was suggesting a strong discontinuity, a kind of a break between the pre-Aksumite and the Aksumite period. On the contrary, now, on the basis of the Bieta Giyorgis and also the Seglamian evidence, we can state that there were many elements of continuity. But of course, both on Enda and on Nagast, there were also later occupations. For example, in Enda we have also Aksumite tombs dating to the early and classic Aksumite phases, that is between the mid-1st century before Christ and the mid-4th century AD. And here you can have you can get an idea about the structure of one of these tombs, which were characterized by stairs, dromos, and so on, and by the big regular stele, like the ones we were looking at, reemployed in the churches. And in Nagast, we have also palaces going back to phases later than the Proto-Aksumite, like this one, a very complex situation brought to light in excavation unit on Nagast 4, 6, and 10. And we were starting also remarking that the material culture associated with the different assemblages we were finding was showing different features in the different layers, in the different strata we were excavating. So we started phasing the Aksumite culture, which is also something new, because also when speaking about Aksum, let's go back to the handbook by Janfrey, Les Anciens Ethiopiens. Well, it was only distinguishing two periods in the Aksumite history, the pre-Christian and the Christian. But, of course, we could remark that there were many more periods characterized by gradual changes in the material culture. So we were able in this way, this was the PhD research of my colleague Cinzia Perlingeri, to outline a ceramic sequence. You see it on the left, a reference ceramic sequence for the Aksum region, showing that on the basis of the changes in the ceramics, at least 5 phases, 6 phases, including also the post-Aksumite, could be distinguished. And you see the strong continuity characterizing these phases. Of course, we could also start suggesting a chronology, an absolute chronology for these phases, and this was done first on the basis of the associated imported materials, which was part of my PhD dissertation, the study of these imported materials, because you have quite a number of imported materials from the Mediterranean, mainly from the Mediterranean, but also from the Nile Valley, and also from the Gulf in the Ona Nagast and Ona Enda Zewge assemblage. And of course, we know the chronology of these imported materials, and we can suggest on this basis, using the approach which is called cross-dating by the archaeologists, suggest also a date for the associated Aksumite materials. Moreover, we were also finding coins, so we could also, on the basis of the sequence of the kings, which was reconstructed on the basis of the coins, suggest an absolute chronology for some of these assemblages. And of course, we were using also radiocarbon dating, and with quite a number of radiocarbon datings found in association with these materials distinctive of the different phases of the Aksumite culture. At the end, we were able to propose also an absolute chronology for the different phases we were able to identify. And this allowed us also to start thinking at Aksumite history in a different way, because we could start trying, at least trying to write Aksumite history not only on the basis of the epigraphic and textual evidence, as it was normal before this resumption of fieldwork in the early 90s, but we could contribute with archaeological data about some historical issues which are crucial for the Aksumite history, like, for example, the adoption of Christianity. We know very well the story from different Ethiopian and also external sources. We know it, we can follow the transition to Christianity through the royal inscriptions, the Aksumite royal inscription, and also through the coins. At a certain point, the pagan symbols are abandoned on the coins, and they started using the cross. And so we can be sure that the conversion took place at the time of King Ezana, most likely around 340 AD. We know this. But what about the process of adoption of Christianity by the rest of the Aksumite population? Because we know Christianity started from the top in Aksum, as far as we can see, from the royal court. So what about the rest of the people? Well, archaeology suggests that this was a very slow process. And we can see it, for example, if we look at when the crosses are used as a decoration in the pottery. As you can see here, after the conversion, the adoption of Christianity by Ezana, immediately on the coins you have the crossing. On the contrary, on the pottery, which was most likely made by the people and not under the royal control. In the pottery, the crosses start being used as decoration only 150 years after the adoption of Christianity by the king. This suggests that the conversion of the rest of the Aksumite people also in a region nearby the capital city was a very slow and gradual process. So you see, we are adding elements, we are adding evidence on the basis of archaeology to the reconstruction of the Aksumite history. The same can be said about the issue of the involvement of Aksum and these interregional exchange networks, which was a part of my PhD dissertation, the study of this issue. Well, in this way, also using a quantitative approach, we could evaluate on the basis of the frequency of ceramic imported materials in the assemblages we were investigating, in which phases this involvement was apparently expanding. And as you can see here, it was in Middle Aksumite times, that is more or less in terms of absolute chronology, between 350 and 550 AD, that the involvement, the Aksumite involvement in this kind of dynamics may have reached its peak. And this is something very different from what we could imagine on the basis of the textual and epigraphic data. And because we could imagine that, of course, this involvement was at its peak during the reign of Ezana and during the reign of Caleb, which are the most powerful, according to what we know from the textual and epigraphic sources, Aksumite kings. It is not like that, as you can see. It is exactly, precisely in the period in the between Ezana and Caleb that the involvement of Aksum in the long distance trade was apparently at its peak. So as you can see, we could also suggest different alternative views comparing to the ones which were based on the textual evidence. Since the very beginning, the research project on Bieta Giyorgis was characterized by a very strong attention to the bioarchaeological studies. So, and also this was new for Ethiopian archaeology. When we started in 1993, well, at the time, there were no archaeobotanic, no archaeozoological studies in Ethiopian archaeology. It was something completely new. And of course, also the British expedition, which was resuming fieldwork more or less in the same years, in 93, 94, was paying more attention also to these aspects. So in this way, we could reconstruct, as you can see, the distribution, the qualitative distribution of the animal and the vegetal species which were exploited in Aksumite times. We could change also in this case some assumptions. For example, the introduction from India of the Bos indicus, the zebu. You see it is the dominant species of cattle in the area still today, as you can see from the picture in the middle. Well, we could understand that at a certain point in history, there was a change from the Bossotaurus to the Bos indicus, because at a certain point, for example, also in the rock art, you see at the beginning you have ampless cattle represented in the rock art. From a certain point, you have amped cattle represented in the rock art. But when was this change, this shift taking place? When Bos indicus was introduced to this part of Africa, and it became dominant because it is a very strong species of cattle, mainly for tropical environments. Well, the only evidence was to try to get a date for the chronological reference for the introduction of the Bos indicus was these small statues, which was characterized, as you can see, most likely this was put in a temple like Hes Voto. Well, it is characterized by an gaze inscription. This is unvocalized gaze inscription. And Lanfranco Ricci, on the basis of this inscription, he was a very important scholar also for the paleographic studies. Well, Ricci suggested that this was dated to the 3rd century AD. So we could say that in the 3rd century AD, amped cattle was already present in Aksum. But when was it introduced? Well, on the basis of the Nagast and Enda Aboi Zewge archaeological evidence, we may trace back the introduction of ample cattle of the Bos indicus in the area up to Proto-Aksumite times. So we were pushing back these of at least 4 or 5 centuries. Moreover, we were pointing out that there were traces of Vitis vinifera in Aksum. Most likely, they were importing Vitis vinifera, vine, from the Mediterranean already cultivated, already domesticated, and they may have also exploited vine to produce wine. We have some structures near Aksum. Here you see some picture of this rock-cut basins in Nadia Safi, and already the German archaeologists at the beginning of the 20th century, when they recorded these basins for the first time, they were suggesting that these could have been used to press fluids, to extract juice from fluids. Now we have the evidence of Vitis vinifera from Bieta Giyorgis, which is right south of the valley of Addis Safi. So we may suggest that perhaps wine was produced in this area. Moreover, we have some Aksumite vessels starting from the early Aksumite times, which are imitating the shape, as you can see here on the left corner of the slide, of some Mediterranean wine amphora. And this is also an element suggested that they may have produced wine in Aksum. Moreover, this exploitation of the Vitis vinifera may have had also consequences in terms of culture, maybe also of religion, because the vine decorations you see here on this ivory panel started being used at Aksum. This is an ivory panel from the brick arches tomb, which was excavated by the British expedition in the 90s. And so it was a very important tomb dating back to the 3rd or 4th century AD, most likely the tomb of very important people, very rich also in terms of grave goods. And there they found this beautifully carved ivory panels, which are characterized by the vine frieze. And so this suggested that it was not just a matter of economic interaction, but also of cultural interaction that can be traced back thanks to the archaeobotanic studies. Of course, we were conducting in this respect also quantitative studies showing, for example, the balance between cattle and goats and sheep, which were more exploited in the different phases of the Aksumite culture. So we were adding a lot of elements to the debate also about the Aksumite economy. And we were starting also writing environmental history. And this was done not only on the basis of the finds of archaeobotany and archaeozoology, but also on the basis of the palynological studies which were conducted by Michael Di Brasi. And so in this way, we were able to reconstruct the ancient environment. Also, this was something completely new in the panorama of Ethiopian archaeology at that time. Now, fortunately, it's becoming normal also in Ethiopian archaeology to have a very large team, including also different kind of specialists, also bioarchaeologists, but at the time it was something completely new. And we were trying to trace back also the evolution of leading to the present environment to try to understand how the environment on top of Bieta Giyorgis changed through time from Aksumite times to the present. So we were conducting a lot of ethnoarchaeology to map, for example, the land use, and on the basis of this to try to understand how land use changed through time on the basis of our archaeological evidence. We were mapping the different types of soils, as you can see on the right, with the involvement of geoarchaeologists. And of course, at that point, it was crucial also to extend our investigation to outside on Nagast and on Enda Zewge, and to conduct territorial studies for understanding also how the human settlement adapted to this changing environment, how the human settlement was related to the distribution of the different kind of resources like raw materials, but also agricultural land and water. And so we started in 2000 survey, and I was conducting this with Michael Di Blasi at the time. I was a field director of the expedition. So with Michael, we were surveying the area of the top of Bieta Giyorgis and the slopes of Bieta Giyorgis. And later on, the survey was extended also to the valleys north and west and east of Bieta Giyorgis, as you can see from the Iconos satellite image on the left side of the slide, showing you the red line is showing more or less the contour of the surveyed area. And in this way, we started understanding also the relation between the sites and the agricultural land, and also how the settlement pattern changed through time. And this became a part of the PhD research of Luisa Cernicola. Actually, all the maps you see in this slide showing the changes in the settlement pattern from the Proto-Aksumite to the late Aksumite times are based on the elaboration made by Luisa for her PhD dissertation. And we were also counting the sites, calculating their extension on the basis of the surface evidence, and so on. So we could understand, for example, the number of the sites was increasing progressively from Proto-Aksumite to classic Aksumite times. After that, as you can see, it was decreasing, but it was not a matter related to demographic changes, to the change of the number of people living in this area. Most likely, this change, which is also very evident in the extension of the settlement of Nagast, you see it is increasing from Proto-Aksumite to Aksumite, classical Aksumite times, and after that it is decreasing. Why? Because the people was moving from the countryside, from Nagast to Aksum downtown, which was starting developing already in early Aksumite times, and now it was progressively increasing its size and most likely its inhabitants, also attracting people from the countryside. So the people were most likely concentrating in Aksum. In late Aksumite times, you have a different situation because the number of the site is still quite low, as you can see, and also Aksum downtown is becoming smaller. At this point, there was something happening. We cannot tell what was happening, and most likely this was perhaps affecting also the demography in this area. Luisa suggested that maybe we are between the mid-6th century and the 8th century after Christ. As you can see, maybe at the time, at the very beginning of the late Aksumite phase, the plagues which were affecting a large part of the ancient world were also affecting the Aksum area. Anyway, this is a point to be explained. And of course, we were also excavating some of these sites we were identifying in the survey. So we could get, for the first time, excavated not just part of the larger settlements with the monumental structure and so on, but also some rural settlements, some scattered houses in the countryside, which were most likely inhabited, used by the farmers in Aksumite times. Here you have some pictures, maps and pictures of some of these structures we were excavating. So we could start reconstructing the rural landscape, let's say. But we were also dealing with the so-called off-site archaeology. That is, in the survey, we were not only recording the archaeological sites with traces of structure and so on, but also other kind of spots which were anyway relevant to the ancient people, like, for example, the border inscriptions. Here you have an inscription on the southwestern side of Bieta Giyorgis. This is made on a boulder, most likely is the 3rd century AD inscription, and this is marking the border between two areas which are related to two different families. So we are in this way also collecting some elements about the management of the land. We were recording quarries like the one you see on the top right corner of the slide, where they were extracting this sienitic rock, which was used both for the buildings and for the stele. We were recording some ceremonial places, open air ceremonial places, like in the case of these boulders I'm showing you with the pointer. This is Gobo and there, and these are natural boulders, but most likely for their shape, for their location, they were considered somehow meaningful, important by the ancient people. And for this reason, they were putting quite a lot of several hundred small model vessels and beakers and cups under these natural slabs. And we were recording also water management systems, like the well of the kings, the Nagast I was mentioning before. You see it here when it was dry at the end of the dry season, but it is still working. They are still collecting water in it. And we were also remarking that there were also traces of ancient terraces and ancient structures used for the water management. Like in this case, we are on the northern side of Bieta Giyorgis, and in the area of Guadagazien, we were recording a terrace system associated with these walls, which were practically kind of dams, which were lowering the water of this stream, most likely to avoid the excess of erosion. You know, still today, due to the very intense rains in the summer season, the soil erosion is a real problem in this area, and it is slowly eroding all the agricultural soils. So since ancient times, but this is the first real evidence of this. Most likely they were also elaborating strategies, systems, like they were doing, for example, also on the other side of the sea in Saudi Arabia, to try to manage this issue, to avoid the excess of soil erosion. And we were focusing on this specific aspect also in the framework of the collaboration with the University of Florence, with Professor Giovanni Ferrari and Dr. Rossano Ciampalini, because we were remarking mainly on the northern side of Bieta Giyorgis that sometimes you have these boulders which are characterized by the traces left by the plow. So it means that sometimes in the past, because now these areas are very poor areas, as you can see, with all these boulders which are almost on the surface. So it is impossible to cultivate there today. But the fact that you have these traces left by the plow, and this is the traditional Ethiopian plow, which is called maresha. Well, this fact suggests that sometimes in the past, these areas were cultivated, and we could try to suggest when it was, on the basis of the distribution of the archaeological sites, on the basis of the identification and of the study of some paleosoils. So in this way, Dr. Ciampalini was able to propose, to evaluate the erosion rate in Aksumite times. And it was a very low erosion rate, also comparing to the erosion rate in recent times. This means that the systems, the terraces and so on, they were using to try to face the issue of soil erosion were very, very good. They were working very well. And so this is an important point I wanted to stress, because this is something also related to the meaning of doing archaeology in these areas in the present, because of course you should consider that archaeology can contribute, as Professor Fattovich stressed many times, also to the study of this kind of environmental degradation. And we can contribute to understand better when there was a soil erosion and to understand why there was a soil erosion. Well, you know, already in the 70s, Karl Batzer, I don't know if you already heard about Karl Batzer. Batzer is the father of geoarchaeology, we can say. Well, he was working in Aksum at the time, and it was remarking that there were phases of very intense erosion in the first centuries AD. As you can see here, this is a schematic representation of the profiles studied by Batzer in different parts of Aksum downtowns, and again in the 7th, 8th century AD. And so he was thinking that maybe in these two phases, this erosion was due to intense rains, and this could have explained at the very end the crisis of the Aksumite kingdom at the end of the late Aksumite phase. According to Batzer, this environmental degradation, this environmental crisis leading to the erosion of the agricultural land was related to the fact that there was a major human impact on the environment. So they were cutting all the trees from the edges, from the slopes of the hills, and this caused erosion. Well, this model proposed by Batzer should be changed according to the results of the investigations by Dr. Ciampalini. Actually, it seems that also after the deforestation of the hills for several centuries in Aksumite times, as I told you, the erosion rate was very low. It means that also after the end of the bushes and the forests characterizing the hills and the slopes, they were able to manage soil erosion, most likely because of these terrace systems. The problem most likely is related to the lack of maintenance of the terrace systems at the end of the Aksumite period, most likely at the beginning of the late Aksumite period. Because at that time, for some reason, as I was showing you also looking at the maps of the pattern. The number of settlements and most likely also the inhabitants decreased for some reason. So this may suggest that a part of the countryside was abandoned. So the terrace system were no more control. There was no more maintenance of the terrace systems, and this may have caused their collapse. And at the end, the phase of very intense erosion, which was also remarked by Batzer. So you see how this kind of approach was also opening a new perspective of investigation. Finally, I want to show you only the last kind of methodology we are trying to adopt for studying the very rich data sets which were originated by this research project on Bieta Giyorgis. We are trying to use these data sets which are very large, and they are informing us on very different aspects of the social, economic, and also environmental condition of the time, to test the application in archaeology of agent-based models, which is a system to understand how the complex systems were working. So this can provide you different models. In archaeology, usually we can investigate and describe a starting point on the basis of our data and the ending point of a process. But how the process was connecting the 2 points, the point A to the point B. Of course, to reconstruct this, it may be useful to use this kind of simulation system. And of course, at the end, you don't have just one answer. You may have different trajectories connecting A and B, but you can go back to the field and you can try to get more data to check, to test if the correct trajectory connecting the 2 points you have is A or B. So this is a very exciting perspective because it can enlarge all our possibilities of interpretation on one side. On the other side, it's also very good for the people who are implementing this kind of softwares of application, because they can test their application on sound data like the ones available to the archaeologist. And I think that with this last insight into what we are doing, we would like to do in the near future with the data from Bieta Giyorgis, I think that my presentation is finished, and I thank you very much for your attention.